Carried. Right, on to item 12. This is our second to last. We should get through this before lunch. Does anyone need a break? We should move straight to this. Yeah. Right, move to item 12, the annual update on delivery of Te Tarakia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Matthew Blakey taku ingoa. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Auckland Council, and I lead the team responsible for Te Tarakia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. I'm joined today by Petra Pearce, our lead climate resilience advisor in the Chief Sustainability Office. The item today is to present to you an overview of the Progress Report 2022 for Te Tarakia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. I will start with this roadmap of climate action, roadmap of Auckland Council's climate action response. And you can see it goes back to 2015 in terms of our membership, our joining C40 cities and our climate leadership through C40 cities. I won't go back to 2015. I will start with last year in terms of 2021. This is an update on the last year. So as you all know, a $152 million climate action package was approved as part of the 10-year budget, 2021 to 2031. Since then, there has been some significant progress, or significant updates, I should say, at both a global level, a national level, and at a regional level. So in terms of updates over the last year, there has been at a global level 2 very significant IPCC reports published, one relating to climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and a second one relating to the mitigation of climate change. Both very clear in their messaging that urgent action is required and that time is running out for that urgent action to take place. There's also been significant updates at a national level in terms of the publication of the government's first emissions reduction plan and the first national adaptation plan, both of which are important for Auckland to consider and certainly have an influence on our climate action performance and the ability for us to respond to climate change. You will all be familiar with the climate action targeted rate that was adopted earlier this year. So $574 million of revenue raised through the climate action targeted rate, which will unlock additional funding through central government co-funding and additional fair revenue, taking that total investment to over $1 billion. Of course, a few weeks ago, the Transport Emissions Reduction Pathway was adopted by this committee, and that was a significant step forwards in terms of our approach and the clarity around the need to respond to climate action through transport interventions and through transforming the transport system. I will come on to that later. The progress report itself, you will have seen this diagram before from the last update. The progress report itself is focused on evaluating progress, summarising our successes and challenges, and outlining future focus. In terms of the reporting, the last progress report was presented to you in December of last year. We're now coming back to you in September of this year, so 9 months later, not a full year later, to present the progress report to you. Reporting will be in or around September, depending on the committee dates, from this date forward to align with other reports, other key reports, and to ensure we can provide combined advice. One thing to note is that staff from across Auckland Council and CCOs have provided input for the progress report, which was attached to the committee papers. This is a progress report with content from across Council and CCOs, not just from the Chief Sustainability Office, recognising that this work is work for all of Council and all of CCOs. It's not just the role of the Chief Sustainability Office, although we do manage the delivery of it and are responsible for it. The next slide identifies the governance structure for Te Tarakia Tawhiri, and you will have seen this diagram before, so if I quickly talk through this from the bottom up, you will see the priorities outlined there in terms of natural environment, built environment, There are then a number of action owners and partnerships that need to be in place to ensure that this is delivered effectively. And those action owners and partnerships are both internal to council and CCOs and external. It is worth noting and reminding, an important reminder that Te Taraki Tāwhiri is a regional plan. It requires action and commitment from a range of regional stakeholders. It's not just Auckland Council's plan. One way in which we've looked to progress the delivery of the actions that Auckland Council has either control or influence over is through establishing a priority leadership programme internally where priority leads are responsible for accelerating progress in terms of the delivery of actions in Te Taraki Tāwhiri. The Chief Sustainability Officer is the lead for Te Taraki Tāwhiri. On the right-hand side, you see some of the region-wide elements. So the Rangatahi Ropu, which is in the process of being established. Advisory panels, we have a cross-panel climate change working group that meets every 3 months or when needed, made up of members of the demographic advisory panels, and an independent advisory group that was established during the development of Te Taraki Tāwhiri. A leadership group is in the process of being established. This is a regional leadership group to accelerate the implementation of actions and very much focused on cross-sectoral partnerships. And then on the left-hand side there, you'll see the Auckland Council focus. So we have a political reference group that has been set up and meets every 3 months, and of course the Environment and Climate Change Committee, whose remit includes Te Taraki Tāwhiri. In terms of the monitoring and reporting framework, I'll work from top to bottom here. We have the targets that are set in Te Taraki Tāwhiri in terms of the 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. These targets are aligned with Auckland delivering on its fair share contribution of the objectives of the Paris Commitment, or in other words, our fair share contribution towards limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is about us delivering our fair share. Climate adaptation targets are in development and extensive work is underway relating to those. The priorities at the top, the 8 priorities, are identified. There's a number of action areas under that. So there's 5 action areas for natural environment, for example, with 25 actions sitting underneath that. And that works across, as you can see. The progress indicators, there are the headline indicators, which are the red circles there. You can see there's 2 for natural environment, and then every 3 years we'll be doing a deep dive looking at all of the indicators. So you can see there's 8 for natural environment and looking at the more detailed indicators across the plan. The cross-cutting indicators are emissions by sector, net emissions and gross emissions. You will see in the progress report that we don't yet have indicators for Te Pua Waitanga or Te Tātai. This is a priority focused on Te Ao Māori principles. It outlines 7 Te Ao Māori principles that need to be interwoven throughout the other priorities and actions in a meaningful way to ensure that those principles inform the design and development of climate action going forwards. Work is underway, and I feel progress has been made in the last 9 months, but we still have a way to go on that. And I want to acknowledge that because I know that was a point that was made at the last progress update, that we do need indicators for Te Pua Waitanga or Te Tātai to ensure that accountability is in place. In terms of the action areas, so this is the evaluation of the actions within the plan. What you see on the left-hand side there is the breakdown by priority in terms of actions that are in blue, complete, green, on track, dark blue, partially underway but require more work, and red, not started. The top bar represents the overall proportion of actions. So you can see there that 33% are on track, 51% are partially underway but require more work, and 15%, are not started, with 1% complete. When we compare that to the progress report that was presented in December last year, 33% were on track, so the same number, 39% were partially underway but requiring more work, and 28% were not started. So that's the chart at the bottom of the screen there. So in summary, from 2021 to 2022, there has been an increase in the number of actions that are either on track or underway. So an increase from 72% to 84%, and a decrease in the number of actions that are not started. So a reduction from 28% to 15%. So progress has been made in terms of actions that are underway, but it is important to stress that significant additional action and commitment is required by a range of stakeholders across the region, not just Auckland Council, not just CCOs, but we need to work in partnership with regional stakeholders to ensure that actions are increasing in terms of their delivery and both the speed and scale of that delivery. The progress indicators in Te Taraki Tāwhiri are outlined here. You can see the progress indicators identified, the data for those. We haven't established or confirmed trends relating to these indicators. We have 2 years worth of data and it's too early to establish a trend. But what I have identified here, what the team has identified, is an indication of whether the indicators changed from last year or from 9 months ago. And you can see that identified by the green, amber, red and grey. In terms of that change. And just to note that some of those have been impacted by lockdown, as you might expect, and obviously the circumstances of the last year. But there are certainly some positive messages in there in terms of, if you look certainly at the work that Auckland Council has done to engage with communities, significantly more Aucklanders have been engaged in living a low-carbon lifestyle, and certainly we've exceeded our target relating to Auckland schools engaged in sustainability education. That's an increase from last year. There was a decrease in the number of litres of diesel, a decrease in the number of litres of petrol purchased annually, but a slight increase in the number of litres of diesel purchased. So you would expect that in terms of petrol because of the lockdown that we experienced towards the end of last year. Petrol consumption was down 11% last year compared to previously. Apologies for the delay. We seem to have a low battery on the controller. So in terms of the cross-cutting indicators in the plan, it is worth noting here that one of the cross-cutting indicators is the regional greenhouse gas inventory. The greenhouse gas inventory in the progress report is the same greenhouse gas inventory that was presented 9 months ago. It is the inventory to 2018. Therefore, we can't comment on a change since the last progress report because we're using the same inventory. The 2019 inventory will be published shortly later this year. We do know that the same message as last year, that gross emissions increased by 2.5% between 2016 and 2018, which is clearly not the trend that we're looking to continue, but that is a historic trend in those 2 years. So we do need to see those emissions sharply declining to meet our targets for both 2030 in particular and 2050. Climate adaptation targets are in progress and we will be coming back next term with an update on that. I've spoken about the progress indicators and the status of the actions relating to Te Taraki Tāwhiri. I think it's important also to highlight that there has been important progress for climate action and climate action leadership over the last 9 months, including the development and approval of the climate action targeted rate, a significant step forward in terms of raising additional investment for transforming our public transport system and investing in low carbon transport, improving the access to public transport for many more Aucklanders, and delivering increased walking and cycling infrastructure, decarbonising our ferry fleet and growing our urban ngahere. You are all familiar with this due to the hours of workshops we had discussing this. But it's important to note this as part of the progress that has occurred in the last 9 months. Equally, the transport emissions reduction pathway, a response to Te Taraki Tāwhiri in terms of outlining clearly the transformational change that's required to deliver on that 64% reduction in transport emissions by 2030. We now have that very clearly in place. The challenge now is to implement that and consider that across all our transport planning investments, such as the ATAP, the RLTP, and also our land use planning, such as the future development strategy. So my last slide here, in conclusion, what's next? At a very high level, there's a lot that needs to occur. Significant additional action and commitment is required by a range of stakeholders across the region, and we need to be leading a lot of that change, working in partnership and collaborating with other stakeholders to ensure that the change occurs in a rapid and impactful way. So facilitating the accelerated delivery of Te Tara Kia Tāwhiri is a key focus for the next year, and in particular a key focus for my team, the Chief Sustainability Office. We now have additional staff on board with the expertise to deliver on this. We have both additional capacity and capability to really accelerate the response and deliver further on the climate action response for Auckland. So I'm very much looking forward to that. We need to very much focus on the delivery in partnership with Mana Whenua as a priority. Te Tara Kia Tāwhiri was developed in partnership with Mana Whenua. As was indicated earlier in the Shoreline Adaptation Plans item, there is a challenge in terms of how we translate that governance arrangement in terms of partnership to an implementation and operational level. How do we ensure that the delivery of Te Tara Kia Tāwhiri is done in partnership with Mana Whenua to uphold the partnership approach that was outlined in Te Tara Kia Tāwhiri? And we're working towards that, and we have a hui the week after next to discuss that with Mana Whenua. We need to focus in on the delivery of the LTP climate package to ensure that it's delivered on time and that we're maximising the impact of the funding that's available. We need to deliver the climate action targeted rate in the most efficient and impactful way, with the focus this year being ensuring that the governance structures and the plans for programme delivery are in place. The Transport Emissions Reduction Plan needs to be implemented in a meaningful way, and I've touched on the need for that to inform and shape transport planning and investment going forwards. That absolutely needs to be a priority if we're going to meet our 2030 target. Climate Connect Aotearoa, which many of you may know as the Climate Innovation Hub, funded through the LTP Climate Action Package, is set to launch later this year. And will develop both a virtual and physical hub for partnerships and for climate innovation to really look at what the opportunity is for the region to lead on that. And my last comment there, fundamentally, we really need to focus in on the need to embed climate action across all our planning, investment and decision making. We're only going to arrive at where we need to be if it is central to every decision we make, and it's central to every planning decision and every investment decision. It's not an add-on, it needs to be very much central to everything we do. I will finish there, very happy to answer any questions, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and sorry, Petra, I didn't introduce you if you had anything to add. No, thank you. We have our first question from Member Wilson.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Thank you. A lot of work being done in that period of time, and appreciate that very much, Matt. But I think 9 months ago, I asked the same questions that I want to ask today, and you've already touched on them briefly, saying that it is difficult, and there's a hui to be had around partnerships. So that was brought up last hui, 9 months ago, and also the ability to look at the priorities, specifically Te Pua Waitanga o Te Tata, and it hasn't any measurement beside it. That also is a bit of a worry. So I'm wondering why, with all the great progress that's been done throughout the other priorities and measurements attached to them and indicators that exist, there is none, or there isn't any ability to get any around the priority that's been acknowledged and partnerships. Why is that the case, do you think?
Through the chair, thank you, Member Wilson. So firstly, to acknowledge your question, I'm very aware of this. It is a priority, and it has been something we have been working on and in discussion with a number of staff working on Māori outcomes, certainly over the past 9 months. So the answer to your question, why are there not indicators and measurement in place for Te Pua Waitanga or Te Tātai? The first thing to note is that indicators to measure progress were in place from the start for the other priorities. They weren't in place for Te Pua Waitanga or Te Tātai. So the indicators we're measuring against for the other priorities were in place. The task we have now is looking to understand how you measure progress against the Te Ao Māori principles into Pua Waitanga o Te Tata in a meaningful way. We've had a number of discussions with Māori Outcomes staff to understand how we do this. Not all advice is aligned. We've had certainly very useful and valuable conversations, and certainly have appreciated the time and the knowledge that the IMSB member staff IMSB staff have provided us over that time as well. So I'd like to acknowledge that. We are working towards understanding how we do that. Now, do we do that looking at those Te Ao Māori principles? Do we do that on a sliding scale, recognizing that you can't necessarily measure that from a numerical point of view? It's not like measuring litres of petrol consumed, for example. What we've attempted to do in this report is outline key projects that demonstrate or foster those principles, to highlight where projects are doing that well. This is very much something, and I acknowledge that we need to be better at this. I've certainly gained a lot of knowledge over the previous 9 months, as well as other members of the team, but we need to be much better at this, and we need to understand how we do this better, and we can only do that through working with staff with Matauranga Māori, staff who understand Te Ao Māori and mana whenua. There is a hesitancy amongst staff to look to measure progress against Te Pua Waitanga or Te Tātai without feeling that they have the credentials, the knowledge to do so. So it's a difficult space. I'm not saying it's not straightforward, but we are committed to improve on that. And I acknowledge that you asked me in December last year how we were going to do this, and that this needed to be in place for accountability. At that point, I wanted to come back today with that fully shaped up so that I could present that back to you and others, but we're not there yet. But I feel we have made progress in terms of our understanding.
Thank you. Just a supplementary, if I can, Mr. Chair. There's no progress shown. Let's call it what it is from 9 months. Hence, the partnership kōrero, on the slide there, I was looking most intently for mana whenua, and I did see a title there, but it was an internally focused staff training, which also meant that there was no partnership role for mana whenua. Can you give me some detail around what it's intended to convey in that slide? I think it was slide 4 on your presentation.
Through the chair. So slide 4 relates to the partnerships and governance update. So this is the partnerships and governance structure that was approved by the Environment and Climate Change Committee a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, after the approval of Te Tarakia Tāwhiri. So there isn't an explicit mention of or identification of mana whenua in this diagram. The assumption here, and I believe the need, is for mana whenua to be working with Auckland Council in partnership in the way that the partnership was intended. So bringing together a Te Ao Māori view of climate change and a Western science view of climate change, so that is our approach. Mana whenua are not identified as a separate box on here because the action owners and partnerships is where mana whenua would sit. They're integral to the development and delivery of Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, and I recognise that that was certainly the case in the development, but that partnership has not translated into delivery in the way that it could have done, and that needs to be addressed. The leadership group mentions mana whenua explicitly as potential members of that regional leadership group, along with other leaders from sectors of the economy and society. So that may be the mana whenua reference you're referring to on that slide.
Thank you. I think I have more comments than I do any more questions, Mr. Chair. Shall I leave that there for the time being?
Yeah, thank you, Member Wilson. Yes, we'll have you down for comment as well. Councillor Henderson, part-time.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a few questions here. So if we're looking at the actual attachment here, I've just got a couple of questions on this. On the bottom paragraph of page 12, when we're talking about special character provisions, could I ask you to expand on that opinion in the report on the impact of emissions reduction?
Through the chair, so you're referring to the section on the MPSUD in the report. So you'll notice that the wording in there is closely aligned with the climate impact statement from the committee paper that was presented on the MPSUD. You asked for my opinion on that in terms of special character and the impact on emissions, is that correct? So my opinion on that is that clearly we are in the process of looking to understand how intensification can occur across Auckland, and special character areas are a key part of that discussion and have been a key part of that discussion. It's clear that if we apply special character to large areas of the city that are within walkable catchments of the city centre and train stations and transport stops, we will be losing the opportunity to intensify in areas that deliver the most benefit from an emissions reduction perspective in terms of access to amenities, access to employment, access to transport. So my view is that it's clearly a complex discussion and there's many elements to it, but it is important to note that special character applied in certain locations will reduce the opportunity for a quality compact urban form that can support a reduction in transport emissions.
Thank you. Moving to 20, sorry, I didn't make a jump around the attachment here, but page 24, the third paragraph here, which starts the transport emissions reduction pathway. I see an alarming stat here at the bottom, which says, without intervention, Auckland is expected to continue expanding and the average motorised vehicle trip length is expected to increase by around 5% by 2030. Could I get you to kind of explain that a little bit more, because I'm a little bit confused about that?
Through the chair. So that material has been taken from the Transport Emissions Reduction Pathway document. So the statement itself is based on work that has been done, analysis to understand if Auckland's urban form continues to grow spatially, it will result in an increase in vehicle kilometres travelled over that time period.
And sorry, is that foreseen growth or is that extra growth in addition to planned? Because we're already growing out to places like Red Hills, Drury, places like that.
So I'm just looking for that section in the report to make sure that I'm in line with what is stated, but...
Yeah, sorry, I've got, it's page 24, third paragraph, in that attachment A.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for confirming. So, yes, the wording is... I'm just going to make sure the wording is correct. So...
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So it does. I just wanted to make sure that I'm correct in my assumption here, without intervention. So without intervention, the point being made that based on the current planned growth and trajectory, that will be the situation in terms of vehicle trip length expected to increase by 5% by 2030. So that's without intervention to change the current development pattern that is expected.
Thank you. Thanks. That's very helpful. Just one last question, if I may, Chair. I was hoping in the report, in the local board section, for a bit of an update. But is your team working with the local boards that are producing the climate action plans? And is there anything we can do to help in that area?
Through the chair. So yes, my team is working with the local boards developing the climate action plans at the local board level. Both my team and the Environment, Education and Community Climate Action team, so Lucy Hawcroft's team, very much looking at how we can provide guidance and advice and also ensure that there's a link between regional direction strategy and local implementation. But importantly, one of the key areas for focus is what are the levers that local boards have to implement meaningful climate action?
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that, Matthew. In the report, you've said that the latest stats are we have to rely on 1919, but since you published the report, of course, we've had the Stats New Zealand figures, and the good news is that our emissions between 2019 and 2021 dropped by 11%, and in every category. And the not so good news is that that's largely due to the COVID restrictions. Have you been able to draw anything further out of those statistics, removing the impact of COVID, if that is possible, to see if there is an underlying improvement in the trend, or is it just too early to tell on that?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. So the Stats NZ data that was published for 2021 looked at the different regions across New Zealand and attributed emissions to those different regions. So my initial look at that and feedback I've received, so Auckland household emissions have reduced by 16%, Auckland industry emissions have reduced by 10%, reflecting the reduction in manufacturing over that time period, both of which have been impacted by COVID lockdowns, as you've said, Mayor Goff. Clearly, Auckland was impacted by lockdowns more than other regions in that time frame. One of the key elements that we've drawn from that is that transport is the biggest change in that reduction. So household emissions in terms of energy consumption at a household level remained relatively stable, but transport emissions decreased during that time. They were the most significant proportion of that household emissions decrease. As I mentioned earlier, petrol consumption reduced by 11% during that time frame. So there's a direct correlation there between petrol consumption and emissions. So vehicle kilometres travelled we would expect to be down, and that's reflected in the data. It is too early to say whether that is a future continual downward trend. Clearly we hope it is. But we do need to just take into account that the last year or two have been certainly different to previous years and what was expected. It's also important to note with the way in which Stats NZ accounts for greenhouse gas emissions by region, they include the agricultural emissions of that region. So you will notice from those stats that Southland, for example, has very high emissions. Canterbury has high emissions. They also attribute emissions from power generation to that region. So, for example, the Waikato has the emissions from Huntly Power Station attributed to it rather than them being attributed to the consumer of that energy, which is the way that we account for emissions in Auckland through our inventory.
So just to follow up, if I may, Mr. Chair, when do you think we'll be able to properly evaluate what the underlying trend is as a result of some of the changes that we're starting to put into effect? Because, yeah, look, the points you've made are totally valid. It'd be nice for us to pat ourselves on the chest and say we've got the lowest per capita emissions of the country, but that, that doesn't take into account agriculture and nor our use of the power that comes out of Huntly. But when do you think we'll be able to get a better idea of how we're tracking? How soon could that be?
So I'll answer that through the chair. I'll answer that question in two ways. So firstly, Auckland Council produces a regional greenhouse gas inventory. As you know from the presentation, the last one is 2018. 2019 is being published shortly later this year. We are reliant on data from MFE, national level data from MFE, and also the Stats NZ regional data for our inventory. The Stats NZ data has been accelerated in terms of its publication. So the 2021 data was published 9 months after the end of 2021. The previous data set, it took 21 months to publish that data. So we are now able to start the preparation of our 2021 regional inventory. So we're playing catch up now that that information has been published, but we can start work on that. So the 2021 inventory will be published much sooner than you would expect based on the 29 inventory coming out soon. It won't be another 2 years, 3 years, it will be sooner than that. However, that's still 2021 and it's still a little way off. The second part of my response is that we are working on the early stages of understanding how we can develop a dashboard to illustrate action on emissions. So a dashboard that draws on data from industry, proxy data that is relevant to emissions reduction, bringing that together in one place so that we can provide not real-time but closer to real-time analysis and information on emissions reduction across the region, and also importantly look to link that back to interventions and policies so that we have a clearer and more up-to-date picture of how we're performing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is all the questions we have, I believe. And we'll move to comment. Member Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew, and your team. And I just want to emphasise at the outset that I absolutely 100% support the recommendation B, which acknowledges all the great work that's being done. It is that disappointment around the inability to, after a 9-month period, to see any obvious progress or even any obvious attempt. So I guess as an outgoing member of the IMSB, it would be really good to see some concrete effort being made, because you did mention it was hard. Believe me, I know more than anyone how hard it is. What is the go forward? It's not a question because we're past question time. The hypothetical, what is it that is going to happen for the incoming member from IMSB to continue to pursue this line of question around a priority that's not being prioritised? That's at the crux of this kōrero. I am hoping that there will be a concrete answer next time when it is canvassed yet again and it involves more than a hui next week. The notion of a partnership being put into a slide that's presented to us all, that in fact doesn't refer to mana whenua nor mātāwaka for that notion, is also something that I find hugely surprising when mana whenua invested heavily into tāruki a tāwhiri, and they would probably be looking for the results of their investment. And if they're not seeing that, maybe it might diminish the value add that they did provide if it's not easily visible. So visibility, accountability, true meaning of partnership, all of those things hopefully will be encompassed moving forward in a progress report or the wider context of the tāruki a tāwhiri, but specifically the priority te pua waitanga o te tātai, so it has some meaning and action attached to the meaning. I'm going to leave it there, but do acknowledge absolutely, recalling you from your very first hui in front of this committee, that a lot of work has been done in a very complex area. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilson. And I also didn't move it, but Deputy Chair Pippa Kern would like to move, and I'll second that. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just really briefly, just want to thank everyone involved for producing what's a really good report. You know, it's easy to thunder from the pulpit around this kind of stuff, and I'm as guilty as anyone. I'll now put my hand on heart for that. But we need to take stock and look at the positive work that's being done, and the report really shows that in a really clear light. So things like the transport emissions reduction work, the climate action targeted rate work, you know, council's not doing nothing. In fact, they're doing quite a lot of good stuff, and I'm really proud of that. The recent announcement of bus drivers getting more money, getting paid closer to what they're actually worth, I think that's really great from a climate perspective, because that will eventually help attract bus drivers, which will try and tackle that cancellation problem, which is really hitting a lot of suburban communities hard. But, you know, at the same time, the report is clear and the media have been clear around this. I've seen an article about that this morning, that some of the big pronouncements here are not actually translating to on-the-ground support when we're working with local communities with projects in their area and trying to convince people that actually there's a big conversation around climate that we all have to have all across the city. And frankly, we've seen local politicians and local candidates that have jumped in on these kind of causes and really stoked that community skepticism and said, look, we've got to tackle climate, sure, but just not here. Just not in this community, just not in this town centre. Well, that's not the sort of attitude that we need to be doing going forward if we're going to actually make meaningful change for people's lives in a difficult climate future. So just that kind of word of warning. I did say I was going to be positive, but I don't want to end on a negative note. Great work, staff, and just acknowledging your work. We just got to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other speakers? No. Just want to firstly acknowledge Member Wilson's comments and concerns, and I share those, and we have discussed them with the team a number of times. And although on a project level, a climate action targeted rate level, TERP level, individual items have been really intense work with Mana Whenua and Mata Waka partnership and engagement, the overall project needs to be prioritised, and I know the team are looking at that. I know that we have only had this funding for just over a year to embed this, and staff and Māori expert advisors coming into Matthew's team have only been of recent, and I think there has been a hesitancy to try and embed something that is not genuine or not with everyone on board. So, but I do totally take on board Member Wilson's points around the way in which Mana Whenua and Mata Waka took in partnership Te Tarakia Tāwhiri and gifted a name and took us through that journey together. It needs to continue through the implementation. But I think at the same time, it's trying, everyone's demanding action, so it's trying to do those two things at the same time, which is clearly not optimal right now. So thank you, Member Wilson, for keeping on that point, and we'll definitely have ASAP a proper situation that can be explained and shown the work through in the next couple of months for the next council and next IMSB to pick up as well. But overall, I did want to acknowledge the work of the Matthew and team and all the staff across the council and CCOs that have worked on climate change related activity, because we had a tiny team with not much resource, with plans being developed to this term having significant plans, far more plans. I know Matthew and his team doing weekends and nights to get things over the line. I think to prepare the climate action targeted rate, most of you worked through your Christmas break to get the actions and things put together, literally walking while running, or whatever the saying is, to get true action on climate. I think of the many things pushed through the climate initiatives in the 10-year budget last year, now with that ramped up with that $1 billion climate action targeted rate, the things that are underway are significant, even down to the boilers in the pools and our switching out our own car fleet that you kind of forget about because we're into bus routes and EV ferries, and the most significant planting program in the history of Tamaki Makaurau that is happening across in our streets and our regional parks. That this is a step forward. It's been great to see near unanimous support for these plans and strategies over the last 3 years as well. So just want to acknowledge our city, but definitely the staff who have driven this and now have the funding to start employing people to actually roll this out to help reduce our emissions and fight the wrath of climate change that is happening on all of our doorsteps at the moment. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to work on this, and this our last major item of the term. We will say all those in favour.
Aye.
Aye.
And anyone opposed?
Aye.
Cool. Anyone opposed? Sorry, I interrupted Councillor Casey. Thank you very much. Carried. And our item 13, our summary of information and memoranda and briefings. Can I have a mover? Deputy Chair, seconder, Councillor Young. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
There was no one to speak to that.
Aye.
Cool.
Aye.
Right, and there were no extraordinary items. And I will just wrap up briefly with a thank you again, and just like to acknowledge the incredible work that has come across this committee over this 3 years, a very, very difficult 3 years. I remember when we kicked off, we had no idea there was a pandemic coming. So there was a lot of hope and promise, and I think we have got there. I think it's probably not good to list, because I'll miss people out, but I think the passing Te Tarakia Tāwhiri and the Transport Emissions Reduction Plan are probably pretty big highlights. Water strategy, so I'm not going to start listing them because there is a list here, but I can see that there are other programs that are missed off this list, so I won't list them all, but just want to acknowledge this term's action, even under the most difficult times, to get what is obviously a greater struggle for our country, our city, and the world is around climate change. When those first couple months, or that first week of the year in 2020 the skies were red from the Australian fires, and then we had pandemics and storms ever since. So I just want to acknowledge the work here, the close working relationship with mana whenua, the things that we've been able to do with our CCOs and with our communities. And I think for the next term, the next council, they've got a big job to do. Hopefully we'll all be there, apart from those who are retiring, that to do this job and continue to basically grow the action that we have told Aucklanders we will do. So thanks to all the staff for this meeting today, and yes, we will head off into the wild blue yonder sunset. And thank you very much for this term, everyone, and thank you to the members of the IMSB and councillors on the line, and have a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. See ya.